We will now move on to the second presentation of the day. Up next, we have Heather Harris with Arcadia University presenting General Acceptance for Scientific Reliability. Does one ensure the other? Please take it away, Heather.
Hello, thank you for having me here today to speak to you about general acceptance and scientific reliability. And the question I want us to think about today is, does one ensure the other? So to give you a brief outline of what my presentation will cover today, I will briefly touch on the Frye Standard, or at least the Frye Standard as I see it for this presentation. There will be lots of coverage of that today, so I won't spend too much time there. I then want to talk about scientific reliability and how do we evaluate that? What does that include so that we know how to recognize it when we're presented with scientific evidence? I then want to talk about the relevant scientific community because it is this community who gets to decide if a technique is reliable. So it's an important consideration. And then I want to take these concepts that Frye lays out for us and apply them to a real common piece of forensic evidence, and that would be the alcohol breath test. So this is a long-standing technique that we use in law enforcement forensic science, and I want to think about it from a Frye perspective. So the Frye Standard comes, of course, from the case law Frye versus United States, and the only criterion that really applies to our forensic evidence is general acceptance in the particular field in which the evidence belongs. So it's a single question. The judge is the individual who ultimately will determine whether or not a scientific technique has been generally accepted. And that should be a reflection of what the field who uses the technique believes about the technique. Frye is concerned with novel scientific evidence. And so when we look at a lot of our forensic sciences, they have been around for quite a while, some approaching 100 years or more. So we have to think about evidence that's not declared novel, evidence that's been around for a long time. How does that get accepted in court? And does it require, or has it required, a Frye evaluation at some point in time? The summary that I want to take from Frye for today's presentation is the idea that an expert opinion is based on a scientific technique is inadmissible unless that technique is generally accepted as reliable in the relevant scientific community. So it becomes the burden of the proponent of the evidence to show that the technique is both generally accepted as reliable and that it is considered reliable by this relevant scientific community. So you can see the two areas within which I'm going to focus according to our outline. That will be the reliability portion and then the relevant scientific community portion. So the first poll question I want to introduce into today's discussion is this one. How often does a court's determination of general acceptance ensure that expert testimony is scientifically reliable? A, all the time, B, sometimes, C, never, or D, I don't know. So to begin our discussion about the two aspects of Frye that I highlighted earlier, I want to think about scientific reliability. I have three different definitions here to help us think about what this term means. The first one is my definition, cobbled together from textbooks and papers I've read and an attempt to simplify it for lecture purposes. And then the second two bullet points, or the last two bullet points, are just simply from a Google search. What did Google return when I searched reliability? So the first one is perhaps more on the scientific technical side of language, but the ability of an analytical process to preserve its accuracy and precision over time is a scientific reliability. But we can also think about it as the degree to which the result of a measurement, calculation, or specification can be depended upon to be accurate. And then the final definition, I think, is one that speaks to a broader term, reliability, a term that we might use not only in the scientific realm, but just with regard to life as human beings in society. And so this one is the quality of being trustworthy or of performing consistently well. So for the last definition, you might say, I drive a Honda because it is a reliable car. And you would be basically defining reliability as my car performs consistently well, I can trust it. So going back to the first definition with regard to the scientific terms, accuracy and precision, we can measure these in the laboratory. They have meanings with regard to tests and results. And reliability scientifically is when our tests can maintain these properties. They can maintain accurate measurements. They can maintain precise measurements over time. And so it does include an element of being trustworthy. Is this test trustworthy? And if it performs consistently appropriately with regard to accuracy and precision, then we can depend upon it. And I kind of jumbled up those three definitions there, but you can see how they're interrelated. An example that I would like to present to you is pretty simple. You can see on the left we have a broken clock, and the clock is not reliable. You can see that it's broken. You can see that someone got angry and smashed it. And so you would not trust that clock to provide you the accurate time. However, that clock will be accurate 2 times a day. If it's, say, 5:49 on that clock right now, twice a day, that clock will be accurate. It will not be reliable. So even though the clock is producing an accurate result, it's not a reliable result. And so accuracy can happen through accident, through coincidence, through happenstance. Reliability is based in performance. It's based in evaluation of accuracy and precision over time. So reliability is bigger than accuracy. And it's important to keep in mind because an analytical result in forensic science may be accurate, but it may not be reliable. And with regard to whether or not we should trust it, we need that evidence of reliability, not just accuracy. So how do we evaluate reliability? If we include scientists, so forensic scientists, analytical chemists, people who engage in measurements, we would evaluate reliability through the scientific method. We would utilize the techniques and the knowledge of how we make observations in the world, we collect data, and then we nowadays perform a lot of statistical evaluations. But we're doing this to try to understand the analytical process, its limitations, and is it accurate and precise over time? Is it trustworthy? Is it reliable? How does the judge evaluate reliability in a courtroom is slightly different. First of all, we have to understand that the judge isn't going to conduct his or her own evaluation of scientific reliability. Oftentimes, they're not properly equipped to do that kind of evaluation. So we see that our judges are simply going to hear testimony, and then they have to make a decision based on that testimony. The proponent of the evidence, the person offering the evidence, will have to put on some type of testimony, and they will define it as reliable. They will try to indicate through testimony or through other means of evidence that it is generally accepted. And then the judge will either take that as true or not. You can end up with a battle of experts that would try to sway the judge's ruling in their favor, of course. But ultimately, the judge has to decide who's telling, I guess, maybe the more reliable story about the reliability and the general acceptance of this technique. So a judge isn't doing the same kind of scientific analysis that a laboratory scientist would be doing. The judge is simply hearing one or two sides of the issue. So we have some tools to guide us into inquiries about scientific reliability. I wanted to start with materials that are available to all practicing forensic scientists, and these are the standards upon which we're seeing our field is increasingly built. For good reason. We're trying to seek consensus. We're trying to seek broader acceptance of these consensus techniques so that we can achieve some consistency across the field and also, of course, reliability. The most important standard for a couple reasons is ISO 17025. If you work in a testing laboratory or are dealing with testing laboratories, you should be familiar with ISO 17025. It is the basic standard upon which good quality measurement science and analytical science can take place. So ISO 17025 is the guide that is titled General Requirements for the Competence of Testing and Calibration Laboratories. This is not a forensic specific guide, so it really does open the concepts of analytical science and good analytical science to the worldwide audience in any kind of testing and any kind of calibration laboratory. Because ISO is so broad, it doesn't cover some of the more unique aspects of forensic science. So laboratories that are accredited nowadays would be accredited under ANAB. Some of you might remember ASCLD of the older days. But now it is ANAB doing the accreditation, and they have their own set of requirements that are specifically designed for forensic science testing and calibration laboratories. And you'll see that the ANAB document somewhat mirrors the ISO 17025 document. But this is another layer of what it means to practice good forensic science. In addition to these laboratory-wide documents, such as ISO and ANAB, we have a set of standards, primarily under the umbrellas of two agencies, but the scientific standards are going to be geared toward the more specific disciplines within forensic science. So the first one I want to mention is the Academy Standards Board. This is the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. And on their website, you can find these ASB standards. And what these are consensus-based forensic science standards. You will find them organized by discipline. So you will find there's anthropology, there's toolmark, there's toxicology. And you can see these standards basically spell out how to do good forensic toxicology, for example. There's a standard for method validation. There is a standard for quality control programs. So the American Standards Board's standards provide these consensus-based standards upon which testing protocols in the individual laboratories can be based. And when you have this consensus across laboratories, at least in theory, you would be increasing the reliability of that technique. NIST has the OSAC groups. The OSAC groups have kind of peaked and waned depending on how they're funded. But the NIST OSAC registry now contains 109 published standards. So these are similar to the ASB standards in that these are consensus-based forensic science standards, and they are intended to provide a consensus protocol upon which laboratories can base their testing, again, to achieve consistency and reliability. You will find overlap between ASB and OSAC. So for example, the toxicology standards you'll see are actually published in both places. So that does not necessarily mean that they are better than ones that are only listed in one place. It just has to do with how the groups are formed. But this is still a pretty large number of standards that are available for laboratories if they want to begin to work in the consensus-based area. To get down to the more evidence base of reliability, here's what you would expect to see in a good scientific setting. So, this is all about generating and evaluating objective and empirical evidence. We want to see actual evidence of scientific reliability, not simply that you follow a consensus standard, but that when you follow such a standard, you actually generate good quality data that is in fact accurate, precise, etc. So you can see we have validation studies. Remember, the validation study is oftentimes the most important component of reliability, because it's that study where you're going to prove that your analytical technique is fit for purpose, meaning it can do what you say it can do. Standard operating procedures are going to be important towards reliability, because that's going to ensure that your individual analysts are actually performing the techniques in the same manner. Traceable reference materials goes right to the heart of accuracy. Forensic science is a science of comparison. We work with unknowns as our evidence, and we compare them to knowns. We sometimes, I think, lose sight of that with regard to modern instrumentation that does a lot of that work for us. But your identification of your unknown is only as good as the accuracy of your known. And so traceability of your reference materials, whether that be drug standards or test reagents, that's really critical to having a reliable result. A quality control program, so this would be mandated by a quality manual. ISO 17025 requires laboratories to have a document titled quality manual. But the quality manual is going to spell out how do we ensure quality at all levels of the laboratory, thinking at the macro level down to the case level. And control charts is an absolute fantastic way to monitor the performance of any given analytical process. You just pick a target quality control sample, and you monitor that on a time regular basis, and you just watch how that performs. You can see trends in the control charts that oftentimes you can't see in individual data results. Uncertainty and measurement determinations. If you are working in an ISO world, uncertainty of measurement is a strong and important indicator of reliability. If you have a small uncertainty of measurement, you've got a nice, tight process. If you have a very large uncertainty of measurement, you probably have either just a difficult analyte, a difficult matrix, or you've got bad science happening. So uncertainty of measurement can tell us something about quality and reliability. And then just some basic things, such as does your laboratory properly keep up equipment and instruments? Is it maintained? Is it cleaned? Do we have contamination protocols? Forensic science is always carrying a heavy weight in the courtroom with regard to the outcomes. And so we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to produce reliable evidence. And so these are some ways that we can do that. I do want to make note of what is not on this list, and that is the actual test result in a specific case. When you have an unknown that you are testing for blood alcohol or for drugs or for DNA, you should go into it with the understanding that you do not know what it is. It is an unknown. And so when you get a result on an unknown, you don't know if it's accurate or not. You don't know if you've got the right answer or not. So you have to be able to trust your testing process. And thinking back to one of those early definitions, you have to trust that your testing process can produce accurate results. And then that allows you to have some accuracy or some feeling of accuracy in your unknown result. Finally, I want to remind you that when it comes to bringing evidence of scientific reliability into the courtroom, it is the responsibility of the proponent of the evidence. In most frameworks, what we're talking about would be the prosecution. They would be bringing in evidence that proves some element of their case. And so if the prosecution wants to introduce a scientific technique, it is their burden to prove that it is in fact reliable. So my second poll question is going to transition us into the second aspect of the Frye Standard, which is the relevant scientific community. So question number 2, who defines the relevant scientific community? A, the court or the judge, B, the prosecutor, C, the defense, or D, the experts? So with regard to the scientific community, Frye uses this interesting language. I think they call it the relevant scientific community. Ultimately, the proponent of the evidence will be the person who defines the community. And again, this might be the prosecutor or the defense, but in most criminal cases, we're going to see this as the prosecutor. And it will be the proponent's expert or their testifying witness who will speak for that community. So we've got somewhat of an inward-looking view at the evidence that supports the expert's opinion testimony. So the one criticism that you could lodge against this is that it can result in a consensus that's established by a narrow field of experts. It doesn't require looking at a broader scientific community. So to put this in the context of those standards we looked at earlier, you could find a consensus in the Academy Standards Board's documents or in the NIST OSEC documents, and that would satisfy this Frye requirement. You don't have to kind of back out to the ISO 17025 level, meaning that you could have some conflict or some contradiction between what the tighter scientific community and the broader scientific community think about a particular issue. I included some tarot cards here because they're fun to look at, but I want to present to you the idea that this is a really powerful element of Frye in the sense that when you have the community funneled through one particular expert who wants to present evidence, it may not be the best evaluation of the reliability of that evidence. And so if you wanted to bring in evidence of a tarot card reading, you would probably find yourself an expert in tarot cards. And so you would bring in the expert in tarot cards, and this person would have to do tarot card readings. And they maybe didn't do the tarot card reading in your case, but they will need to have experienced that type of process before. But if you ask a tarot card reader, are the readings from tarot cards reliable? The answer is going to be yes. This is what they do for a living. Furthermore, do other tarot card readers agree that the results from tarot card readings are reliable? And the answer will also be yes. It doesn't mean that all tarot card readers come to the same conclusions when they read the tarot cards. It simply means that they all agree that you can extract information by evaluating these cards. So that seems kind of goofy, but this is the danger of allowing the proponent's expert to define the community and then also to speak for the community. If you do not have an opponent offering a different view, then you might end up with what might be called junk science in your courtroom or in your court case. And another thing to think about is that the opponent's expert, this idea of the adversarial process, that doesn't necessarily always get you to the right conclusion either. If your tarot card readers if you have a tarot card reader as your expert for one side, your opponent needs to be someone who says no, tarot cards are not scientific. If your opponent is another tarot card reader who just has a different interpretation or a different approach, you're still trapped in that inward looking community. So, it's not only who does the proponent bring in to speak to this issue, but who does the opponent bring in to speak to the same issue. So to bring this to something a little more realistic than tarot card reading, although there could be some comparisons perhaps, I want to talk just for a moment about bite mark testimony for identification. I am not an expert in bite marks. I do not claim to be. I don't know anything about what bite marks are based on apart from just the general information. What I do know is that the Forensic Science Commission of the state of Texas has stated that bite mark evidence does not meet current acceptable forensic standards. So a pretty strong statement about an entire field of forensic science from a state agency. So I take their lead on this, that this is no longer an acceptable practice. But if you look at this from a Frye perspective, you can see how bite mark testimony could make its way into a criminal trial. First of all, we have a relevant scientific community. We have people who are trained as dentists. They can then specialize. We have the American Board of Forensic Odontology. There is the American Society of Forensic Odontology. When you look at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, they have a forensic odontology section. So that sounds very much like a legitimate scientific community. And if you're talking to members of this forensic odontology community, you would have to probably admit that they're going to agree that, in fact, it is a legitimate scientific group. This community can also produce evidence of reliability. They have journals that are produced. There's the Journal of Forensic Dental Sciences, the Journal of Forensic Odontostomatology, the British Dental Journal. So these are peer-reviewed journals that publish articles related to bite marks. Not only bite marks for identification, there's many other uses for forensic dentistry apart from trying to match a bite mark to a person. But think about, again, the situation that we're in, where a judge is sitting there who's probably not trained in bite marks, maybe not trained in a science at all, and he or she is listening to a member of the relevant scientific community speak about the reliability of their work because it's published in these journals. So is bite mark analysis scientifically reliable? I don't think so. And if you listen to the Texas Forensic Science Commission, they say no. They're pretty clear on that. So what's lacking in terms of a scientific analysis of bite mark identification? Well, the big thing is that we're missing an empirical demonstration of unique dentition and sufficient detail in a bite mark, meaning what's left on someone's arm and matching it back to someone's teeth hasn't really been proven that you even have the uniqueness of the teeth or the detail in the bite mark, let alone that you can make those quite strong connections of identification. Reference standards and controls, I don't even know how you would come up with those for this. Each human being has the same teeth, but all of our teeth are in fact quite different. So who is the standard or the control? How do you generate that for this type of analysis? Is there a consensus protocol? Actually, there's some protocols. If you go to the NIST OSAC, you will see there are 3 standards related to forensic odontology. I don't think any of them speak specifically to matching a bite mark to a person. There's disaster identification type standards. but I'm also not an expert in this field, so I don't know if maybe they go too far. I did note that there were no ASB standards. So this is an area where you see standards developed under OSAC, but nothing yet under the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Bite mark analysis is also missing population-based statistics. Do we know how often someone's canine tooth is slightly rotated? Do we have these values so that we can actually assign some meaning? If you want to try to match a mark to a set of teeth, what does that mean? And then that obviously means, how do we competency test or proficiency test these individuals? So there's many challenges to the scientific reliability. If you wanted to go into this further, you could think back to the slide earlier where we looked at validation and traceable references and such, and see how it would be really quite challenging to develop those kinds of studies for bite mark analysis. So bite mark has been admitted to many criminal trials, and you can see that primarily perhaps it's a separation of the reliable from the relevant scientific community that allows that to happen. So I wanted to go into an example where it's a little bit trickier as to how we interpret the use of measurement results in a Frye setting. And so I chose alcohol breath testing because this is a really interesting area where we have what is essentially a scientific technique being conducted by non-scientists. So Intoxilyzer 9000 is an alcohol breath testing instrument manufactured by CMI out of Kentucky. I am not endorsing them. I just am familiar with this, as this is the instrument we use in Philadelphia. And I pulled this image off of the brochure that you can find on their website. But what you're looking at is the breath testing instrument. That's the big gray rectangular box in the middle. Then you see there's keyboards, there's a signature pad, there's a barcode reader. The two things that are scientifically of interest are the two bottle-like features you see there. The one on the left would be a dry gas standard, and the one on the left is the dry gas standard. The one on the right would be the wet bath standard, and both of those can function as a way to check the accuracy and precision of the instrument. And then finally, it's somewhat discreet here, but on the left side of the instrument, there's a black linear looking device, and that's actually the tubing that the participant blow into to produce a result. So you can see, if you read the blurb at the bottom, CMI says the Intoxilyzer 9000 has unparalleled performance in accuracy, precision, and interferent detection by using pulsed infrared technology, eliminating chopper motors or mechanical filters in the analytical system. I mean, that sounds like a scientific technique to me. So my third poll question for today: who is the relevant community for breath alcohol testing? Is it A, police officers, B, prosecutors, C, forensic chemists, or D, the courts? So let's start by evaluating, is breath alcohol testing scientifically reliable? So we do have elements of proper metrology present, and I use the term metrology specifically because metrology means the science of measurements. And what we are doing here is we're taking a measurement. We're measuring the grams amount of alcohol in a volume liter of breath. So we're specifically measuring a particular molecule present in the human breath, and that molecule happens to be ethanol, drinking alcohol. So this is in fact a measurement, a little bit more complicated than measuring, a pencil with a ruler, but a measurement nonetheless. So we want to think about this from a metrological perspective, but we definitely are working with regards to a scientific test as well. We're utilizing infrared spectrometry. There's actually 4 wavelengths that are being measured in the Intoxilyzer 9000. And even when you go back to the early infrared breath analyzers, they were generally looking at least at 2 wavelengths. So we're utilizing the sophistication of modern computers as well as these instruments and our ability to do quite good measurements and quite precise measurements. The breath alcohol instrument is calibrated. There is a calibration that occurs at the factory. And in some jurisdictions, there are calibrations that are allowed out in the field. Other jurisdictions require it to go back to the factory for a full calibration. All breath testing instruments require performance verifications out in the field. So you will see that there are performance verifications that happen on a regular basis, whether it's once a month, some once a day. And then there's also going to be performance verifications that occur within the sequence that includes a suspect's sample. Breath alcohol testing does utilize traceable solutions with defined tolerance ranges. The dry gas or the liquids that go into the wet bath simulator, those are manufactured by specific companies who will issue certificates of analysis. They will tell us the concentration of alcohol that should be present when the calibration solution goes through the instrument, and they will tell us a defined tolerance that is allowed around that measurement. So in other words, if you have a solution that is designed to produce a 0.08, which is our common per se level, the certificate of analysis will actually tell you that it's 0.08 plus or minus some value, creating a range within which the measurement is considered to be accurate. The instruments have a fairly large analytical range. Now, the company says it starts at 0, but I will remind you, you can't measure nothing. So there's some lower limit at which the calibration would end, but the measurements, according to the manufacturer, go up to a 0.650. I don't think there's a human being who could survive a blood alcohol concentration of a 0.650. So the range absolutely covers where we need to work, because we're really working in the 0.01, 0.02, maybe to a 0.3 range, and 0.3 is on the high end of what you would hope to see. We don't want to see many of those. The one thing that's not listed here is uncertainty of measurement. And that was something that we had listed earlier as a component of a scientifically reliable analytical process. Uncertainty of measurement is a critical aspect to any measurement. It's a requirement if you look at the treatises and references of just basic metrology. What we're talking about with uncertainty of measurement is a dispersion of values. It does tell you something about the quality of the test, because if your test is precise, which is desirable, your dispersion is small, and the uncertainty value would reflect that. If your test is not precise, you have a wide dispersion, and that uncertainty of measurement value becomes large, and that is not desirable. But uncertainty of measurement is really reporting to us a probability about our measurement. And so we're going to have the measurement from the instrument, which is our estimate of the true value. And then the uncertainty establishes the range around that estimate. And so then when we bring the result into court, what we really are testifying to is the probability of the true value existing within that range. And so when you see a report with measurement uncertainty included, you have the measured value the uncertainty of measurement, and then you'll see a confidence interval. 95% is the minimum confidence interval allowed in an ISO 17025 setting. And that's getting close to what we would want in a courtroom, I think, because 95% confidence is kind of flipped over to saying, 5% chance of getting this wrong, getting this estimate wrong. So a little bit more about uncertainty of measurement and breath alcohol testing. When you look at ISO 17025, there are 40 references to uncertainty in that document, and it's not a particularly long document. So uncertainty of measurement is really critical to the ISO requirements in a testing laboratory. I pulled out this specific provision for us to look at here today, and it's 7.8.3, which are the specific requirements for test reports. And these are the reports going to your client or your customer. 7.8.3 says the measurement uncertainty presented in the same unit as that of the measurand, which is what you're measuring, or in a term relative to the measurand, when it is relevant to the validity or application of the test results, or the measurement uncertainty affects conformity to a specification limit. So lots of cluttered language there, but when we have a measurand, such as a breath alcohol result, we need to report an uncertainty associated with that. And the 2 bullet points, or 2 smaller bullet points, are the reasons why. The uncertainty of measurement is relevant to the validity, but also to the application of the test result. Remember that in breath alcohol testing, as well as blood alcohol testing, we're dealing with per se levels in many jurisdictions, meaning that if you hit the number, you're guilty. That's how it's a strict liability crime almost in that sense. So uncertainty of measurement would be relevant to the application of the test result, because we want to know what the range is of possible values before we decide whether or not you are above or below a per se value. And then the second bullet point also applies because we're talking about whether or not an individual's breath alcohol level conforms to a specification. If you're below the 0.08, you're not per se guilty. So whether or not you are above it or below it also has to do with this conformity to a limit. So the reading of ISO 17025 would indicate that if you are going to make measurements of breath alcohol, then you need to include the uncertainty of measurement with those breath alcohol test results. But stepping outside of the broad ISO 17025 standards, we can look at the manufacturer's specifications, go to the source. So with the Intoxilyzer 9000, we can see from the manufacturer's specifications in that same brochure that I mentioned, that the accuracy is measured to be plus or minus 3%, or 0.003 grams per 210 liters, whichever is greater. So they're telling us that their instrument has a tolerance range. It has a range of positive or negative values around each measurement. They also tell us in their specifications that their precision is about 0.003 or better. They don't define or better, but we can see that even if you take the 0.003, that is dispersion, right? It's, precision, dispersion, 2 sides of the same coin. This one is reported as standard deviation, but you can see the value is actually not dissimilar from what they have in the accuracy specification above. Both of these indicate, however, that repeated measurement of the same sample does not return the same result every time. And the reason that occurs is because of uncertainty of measurement. So thinking about reliability, we can look at breath alcohol testing for the scientific aspects of reliability. But this is also out in the journals. So this is peer reviewed. I just pulled 4 different journal articles where you can see either a discussion about variation of breath alcohol measurements or articles that are directly on point with regard to the uncertainty of breath alcohol measurements. So there is a scientific community out there that is understanding of the uncertainty of measurement that is associated with breath alcohol measurements, and they are publishing in the peer-reviewed literature. Yet when you get results in an actual case, I have an Intoxilyzer 8000 ticket on the left and an Intoxilyzer 9000, the bigger one on the right. Neither one of these includes an uncertainty of measurement. Looking at the smaller ticket on the left, the final result you can see there in all caps near the bottom is a 0.082. No uncertainty of measurement provided. Looking at the larger one on the right, the subject's result is a 0.172. No uncertainty of measurement included there either. And the officers or the operators of both of these instruments are police officers. So these aren't scientific individuals. Perhaps they have scientific training and coursework. I don't know them personally, but their profession is not metrology, it's not chemistry, it's not measurement science. They are police officers who work in this area of alcohol or accident investigation, whatever it might be called in their jurisdiction, but they operate the Intoxilyzer or whatever instrument they have. These are the same people who will come to court as the witnesses. These will be the individuals who bring these results into court and testify before the judge and the jury as to their accuracy and reliability. So, is a breath alcohol result scientifically reliable without its measurement uncertainty? So I took the result from the prior screen here. We've got a 0.082. That's how it was reported by police. If you apply an uncertainty of measurement that is based in one of those journal articles I showed you, you end up with a 0.082 plus or minus 0.005. That creates a range of 0.077 to 0.087. Remember that in many jurisdictions, we're dealing with a 0.08 per se level. So this is clearly illustrating what ISO is speaking to, that uncertainty of measurement is a critical aspect of this measured result in order to determine how this result should apply to the law. And does this result, how does this result conform with this requirement? If this was your test, you would want the uncertainty of measurement to come into your trial because that provides a possibility that your breath alcohol is actually below the legal limit. Is a breath alcohol result generally accepted without its measurement uncertainty? Well, it depends who you ask. Yes, if it's law enforcement bringing in the result, because as you saw, the tickets generated by the test in the police departments do not provide a measurement uncertainty, and therefore these police officers would not have a value to report. If you had someone who worked in metrology or analytical chemistry, they would want to report measurement uncertainty, and they might be required to report measurement uncertainty if they are working in an ISO 17025 environment. So what kind of Frye challenge could we raise here with regard to breath alcohol testing? There's a few issues around this. The first is that it's not going to be considered a novel scientific technique. Breath testing has been around for quite a long time, and if you're familiar with the name Borkenstein, we're going back into the history of forensic toxicology there, but this has been around for a long time. And so Frye does speak to novel scientific techniques, and breath testing I don't think is going to be considered novel. However, it's inconsistent with modern day metrology. ISO 17025, as well as a number of other metrological standards, are going to say that if you engage in a measurement, you need to report the measurement uncertainty. So the challenge that would be presented to the court is a breath alcohol result without its measurement uncertainty generally accepted as reliable in the relevant scientific community. And you can see what we're going to end up here with is a conflict between the general acceptance from the law enforcement community and the scientific reliability from the science metrological community. Who wins? So I want to revisit my third poll question to see if perhaps you've changed your mind. Who is the relevant community for breath alcohol testing? Is it the police officers, the prosecutors, the chemists, or the courts? Thank you for your time and participation, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Heather, for that great presentation. We will now begin the question and answer period, and we have some great questions for you, Heather.
Okay, I hope I can answer them.
All right. The first is, if organizations such as ANAB are auditing certain fields that are considered subjective, it increases reliability. But does that display general acceptance in the scientific community?
My personal opinion would be no. I think that when we're considering what is reliable, we have to really take a totality of the circumstances approach. I think the bite mark community is an example of that, how you can end up with a consensus-based protocol, but that doesn't give the field overall that scientific reliability. So I would say it definitely checks a box when we're trying to go down a checklist of what is reliable, but I think you would need more. You would need a totality of circumstances.
Great. Thank you. And our second question, if there are inconsistencies or conflicting differences between the forensic science standards that you discussed, which takes precedence in example of a contradiction between the tighter scientific community and the broader scientific community?
So that's a good question. And I first want to cite back to Chris's presentation earlier. He had a court case out of New York where the judge, keenly recognized that the proponent's expert might have a self-interest in the acceptance of what they're offering. So that would be a vote against the tighter community and say it's the broader community's opinion that matters. But then this becomes a judge-specific determination, right? If you have another judge who doesn't think the way that New York judge did and says, hey, I got the proponent, I believe him, he's credible, I like him, he says it's accepted, I'm going with that. I personally would say the broader community, we want forensic science to be reliable and relied upon by the broader community. We're asking courts, we're asking victims, we're asking families of victims, families of defendants to rely upon forensic science. So I think it's only fair that we go to a broader scientific community since we're asking the broader general community to accept our results.
Excellent. For our next question, under Frye, is it up to the judge to determine whether the proponent's expert is sufficient to establish general acceptance in the community, even in the absence of an opponent offering a different view, such as your tarot card example that you gave us?
Right.
Or will there always be an opposing view or testimony for them to consider, such as the opponent's expert?
So I'll work backwards. There's not always going to be an opposing expert because the defendant needs money to hire that expert. If you're in a public defender office, you probably will have some fund that you can tap into to hire an expert. But if you're a guy out there, solo practitioner, and you take on this case, and you've got, a working class defendant who can barely afford the lawyer, there's not going to be funding for the expert. And so it's going to then come down to how effective can that defense attorney challenge on a cross-examination. The judge can be skeptical. The judge can have questions of his or her own of that proponent of the evidence. And so the judge doesn't have to take the word of the witness. The judge can find the witness to be not credible and in their own determination just eliminate or believe the opposite of everything they just heard. So, the proponent is on a side. So the proponent's not going to offer any of that contradictory evidence. So if we're in that scenario where you don't have an opposing expert and the judge is not questioning, I think that's an easy path to acceptance.
Great. The next question, very good, real world type question. And the questionnaire says, in Illinois, we once had a requirement that there be 2 tests from samples taken not less than 15 minutes apart. An association of chiefs of police complained about the amount of time that police officers would be kept off the streets by requiring 2 tests, and the prosecutors would complain about the fact that the results would never be the same. Why should there be 2 different samples?
The reason you want 2 different samples goes to reliability. It also speaks to whether or not we're actually getting the right result. Just to make this simple, if you measured twice and the first result was 1 and the second result was 10, you would be concerned that something was wrong with your test or something was wrong with how you delivered the 2 samples. But that would indicate to you that something's wrong here. You don't know whether 1 or 10 is the correct answer. You just know that they're not even anywhere near each other. So we have a problem. When you do 2 tests, the way in a blood alcohol case it's done, 2 minutes apart, when you do those 2 tests, you're measuring precision. You're evaluating precision, I should say. You're looking at the ability to basically get the same result under the same conditions. Now, it is 2 different breath samples in a breath test. We're not measuring 1 sample twice. We're literally taking 2 different samples separated by that amount of time. So they're not going to be identical because there's no way to guarantee you're getting an identical breath sample out of the human being. And then when you get to the instrument, you have the uncertainty of measurement component, which means you're not going to measure identically. So you're kind of layering in differences. So those results should be different. And if I were to get a series of breath tickets and they were always the same, then I know something's wrong. Something's being fudged somewhere. So from a scientific perspective, they should be different. And I want to see them be different because that means we've got the natural variability. What they should not be is outside of some sort of range. So when you apply uncertainty of measurement to each of these results, it creates a range. And those ranges should overlap, if not identically, very, very close.
Great. And then our next question is there a concern that the jury, who may be aware of the broader community or CSI effect that we know so well, understanding, would be more likely to accept broader community or practitioner community over the more specific tight community in terms of loose reliability over scientific reliability?
This really comes down to jury selection. The prosecutor wants to get members of the jury who are deferential to law enforcement and to the law and will, defer to whatever testimony they hear from law enforcement. And in this scenario, the defense would want people who maybe are a little anti-government or, skeptical of what the man is telling them. You want those kinds of thinkers because they're going to demand the broader community. So this is where the adversarial process is coming into play. if you know this is going to be an issue in your case, you have to pick the right jury back at the beginning to be receptive to the argument that you're going to make. In a Frye hearing per se, it's only a judge. There is no jury. So in a Frye hearing, you're just dependent on your judge. So to the extent that you can select a jurisdiction that has favorable judges, that would be beneficial to you, because it's all about that one person and how they feel.
Great. And then one more question. In your Frye challenge question for breath alcohol testing, what would you conclude? Is a breath alcohol result without its measurement uncertainty generally accepted as reliable in the relevant scientific community? And can you just further discuss poll question 3 and its results in a little more detail?
Well, I thought poll question 3 was interesting because when it was asked initially, they split entirely between police and chemists. And when we redid it, prosecutors and courts got more say in the matter. The relevant scientific community, it's controlled by the proponent. So the prosecutor, again, is probably going to offer a law enforcement police officer type person, because they have the test in their facility. They run the test. They're the ones who bought it. A handful of states, New Jersey's one, I think Washington State is one, where the crime lab has some purview over the breath testing because they do some of the verification test on it. But ultimately, the day-to-day use is out, in a police department with police officers. But it's science. So, this is why I think this is a good example of the conundrum that Frye can present, because at the end of the day, the breath test is an infrared analysis, and that is science. And we went through all the different components of it that would fall under, measurement science. And I just want you to think about the fact that if you're wearing a DUI case and your blood is drawn, your blood goes to a crime lab, your blood alcohol result will come on a report that includes an uncertainty of measurement. But if somehow you get diverted into the police system and you have a breath test, your result will not have an uncertainty of measurement. But both of those results are going to prove the same criminal charge of driving under the influence of alcohol. So, so you're getting two different quality of tests depending on how that jurisdiction shoots you down one road or the other. And you, as the person, who's the suspect / defendant, you don't have a choice. You don't say, I'll choose blood or breath. You do what tests they offer you. And when you say no, you get a refusal. So I think the question that we need to ask is, why do we demand uncertainty of measurement when it's blood and we're letting a pass on the breath? I personally think there should be uncertainty of measurement on breath. It's a measurement. And I work in the chemistry scientific side of forensic science, and we're having to do uncertainty of measurement for weights of drugs, for drugs in blood, for alcohol in blood. This is an exception that's been carved out because of the way the test is administered. And I think in 2023, it's time to get it back in alignment with the rest of the forensic sciences.
Great. And our next question is interesting because you think in labs that you would often use a totally separate method to confirm a test result. So the listener asks, is it required that breath alcohol test, or I guess should it be confirmed in the laboratory with another method before court?
That's a great observation, and you're absolutely right. The standard toxicology protocol is a screening, then a confirmation. Blood alcohol is a little bit different. There's not a traditional screening confirmation analysis, but there are two separate blood samples that get tested, and you can end up with 2 or 3 sets of results. The proponents of the breath alcohol test are going to want to rely on the scientific reliability of the instrument to say this test is enough. So here's where they want it both ways. They want to not, rely on the science when it serves them, which is to just let the number in without the uncertainty. But then they're going to need the scientific foundation in order to get past this argument that, hey, this is just, one quick test on an instrument in a police department. Where's the secondary confirmation, of which there is none? So they're going to have to rely on that information from the manufacturer about how it's calibrated, about the performance verifications, the traceable solutions. That will be how they prove reliability, but that sure sounds like science, right?
Exactly. Well, Heather, it was a great presentation, and thank you so much for answering all of our questions today. I very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.